Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to introduce the SGS webinar for cardiovascular device manufacturers. My name is Gregory Jacobson. I'm the Sales Director for the SGS North America Medical Division. Your speaker today is Ibim Taria. Ibim is our US-based Business Development Director. First, a little bit about SGS. SGS is the world's leading inspection, verification, testing, and certification company. We have over 98,000 employees in over 2,650 locations around the world and expertise across 7 global industry sectors. We provide assistance and expertise with global support and services that cater to all industries. SGS is the largest provider of audits, certification, training, and advisory services. We have the ability to turn your needs into comprehensive solutions with a consistent service delivery via our worldwide network and global footprint. We have highly experienced quality and regulatory experts in the medical device certification area, ready to offer training to you from our SGS Academy. At the end of the presentation, we'll have several links for you to SGS Academy. And an email will be sent later with a link to this recording and a copy of this presentation. There will be Q&A at the end, so please put all your questions in the chat box so we can discuss them at the end of the presentation. There will be a survey on your screen. Please fill it out at the end. Thank you for joining us today. Ibim, over to you.
Thank you, Greg. So the agenda for today's presentation is as follows. We'll talk about the main players in the EU regulatory system, and we'll try and figure out what CE marking really is. We'll then turn to the CE marking processes, the general safety and performance requirements, talk a little bit about technical documentation, which is the repository of the output of GSPR as compliance. Then we'll also talk to technical documentation on post-market surveillance and consider what I've described as a typical EU certification journey. So the main players, starting from the EU Commission and going in a clockwise direction, are the EU Commission. The EU Commission is equivalent to the Federal Civil Service. Remember, in the European Union, you have 27 sovereign member states, unlike in the United States, where you have 50 federating units with one overarching government, which is the federal government. Europe is not quite like that. So the European Commission is equivalent to the Federal Civil Service. They are the ones that draft the regulations, and then the European Parliament considers it. The European Parliament is equivalent to our US House of Reps, and then the Council of Ministers then signs off on it. It is the upper chamber, equivalent to the US Senate. Next will be the member states. These are the 27 member states. Following Brexit, there are now 27 because the UK voted to leave the EU. Each member state does have a competent authority, which is really a government agency. So the direct equivalent of a competent authority of each member state is the FDA. Their sole purpose in life is to maintain public safety. Next will be the notified body. The notified body are third parties that conduct conformity assessments. These notified bodies are in turn supervised by the competent authorities. Indeed, it's the competent authorities that designate notified bodies within their respective jurisdictions. Another player will be the manufacturer and other economic operators, such as the EU rep, importers, and distributors. You also have this new group called the MDCG. the Medical Devices Coordination Group. You see, the EU Commission does not have technical experts on staff. What they tend to do is co-opt members from the sovereign nations. So they will look for people with the right expertise, bring them together, and help them, advise them on technical matters, including writing guidance documents. That's called the MDCG. They are the new sheriff in town. We didn't have an MDCG under the directives. Next is, what is CE marking? Indeed, what do the letters CE stand for? I got some suggestions. Chinese exports, caveat emptor, confusion everywhere. Given the state of the MDR, you may think it's confusion everywhere. Conformity European. Well, in reality, it's none of the above. It's just a symbol to show that a manufacturer declares that they've met all the requirements of applicable regulations. It's a legal mark, and the C is affixed by the manufacturer, you, the manufacturer. The certification, on the other hand, is issued by the notified body where applicable, because for certain types of devices, there's no notified body involvement, and the manufacturer self-declares. The legislation also defines the size of the mark. CE mark is not a voluntary quality mark, neither is it owned by any notified body. Next will be the CE marking process. The picture to your left is a picture of the European Parliament building, which is in Strasbourg, France. And then the pictures to the left depict the type of devices we're talking about today. Cardiovascular devices represented by a stent, or a filter to collect blood clots, or a stent graft. So the CE marking process is as follows. Whatever your widget is, you've got to first determine if it's a medical device. The reason is this. There are some widgets that may have more than one intended purpose, which is why you, the manufacturer, must tell your notified body the intended purpose of your device. I'll give you an example. Take a pair of rubber gloves. They could be used for gardening. They could be used to wash dishes at home. By the same token, they could be used by a clinician in the OR. Clearly, the requirements for each one of those intended purposes will be different. But in this context, we are talking about that rubber glove as a medical device. Then you classify your device, because in Europe, the process is heavily dependent on the risk classification of the device. Once you classify your device, you then select the conformity assessment route. The conformity assessment is then conducted by a notified body, and as I indicated before, for some devices, there is no notified body involvement. The CE certification is also by a notified body, except for where the manufacturer is allowed to self-declare. Manufacturer then signs the declaration of conformity and affixes the CE mark. Thereafter, you can launch your device, pump your champagne, have your party, and make lots of money. However, the party shouldn't stop there. The next phase is the post-market surveillance phase, and there are very explicit manufacturer's obligations which I will discuss later on in this presentation. So, definition of the medical device is in Article 2.1 of the MDR. I'm not going to read it all in detail, but in general, it says a medical device means any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, or other article intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following specific medical purposes: diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, alleviation, modification of the anatomy, providing information, etc., etc. But it's got to be used for humans only, as intended by the manufacturer. And the principal mode of action cannot be pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic. Again, think about this. The definition has to be as intended by the manufacturer. So the whole purpose, the whole conformity assessment has got to be conducted in that context. Thereafter, you classify your device. In Europe, there are three main device classifications: Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Some people say Europeans can't count, because when you get to Class 2, it's further subdivided into 2A and 2B, and 2B under the MDR is also further subdivided into non-implants and implants. Risk classification is based on the manufacturer's intended purpose, as depicted in the upward pointing red arrow. So why do we classify? We classify to ensure regulatory control is matched to risk. So proper selection of the route to CE marking. You see, the European system does not dictate to any manufacturer. It gives you options. So it's up to the manufacturer, based on their business model, to choose a pathway that best suits their own arrangements. Manufacturer is responsible for classification. The notified body will review it and hopefully agree with you. If there's a disagreement in classification, then the manufacturer can seek a resolution of such dispute by reaching out to a competent authority. The requirements are in Article 51, Paragraph 2. So there are classification criteria, and again, going in a clockwise direction, they typically involve duration of contact of the device, degree of invasiveness, whether the device is active or non-active. By active, they mean if it's got any energy in it. And the fourth criteria is the anatomy affected. As it relates to duration of contact, there are three main categories: transient, which means continuous use for less than 60 minutes, short-term, continuous use for between 60 minutes and 30 days, and long-term, which means continuous use for over 30 days. So you got to keep in mind that continuous use means accumulated use if a device is replaced immediately with another of the same type. Invasiveness, or degree of invasiveness. Invasiveness means the device penetrates inside the body via a body orifice or through the surface. Body orifice invasive is regarded as natural opening or permanent artificial opening, such as a stoma. And surgical invasiveness means penetrating the surface in the context of surgical intervention. And there are other definitions you need to be aware of: reusable surgical instrument, active for monitoring or diagnosis, active therapeutic, implantables, and central circulatory and nervous systems, and direct diagnosis. There are a total of 22 classification rules. Again, going clockwise, rules 1 to 4 are applicable to non-invasive devices. Rules 5 to 8 are applicable to invasive devices. Rules 9 to 13 are applicable to active devices, devices that have energy. And then rules 14 to 22 are so-called special rules. So for devices that utilize animal tissue, devices that incorporate a medicinal substance, devices that have nanomaterials, substances, etc. Once you know these rules, then you have to classify your device. And you've got to keep in mind that if you think there are 2 rules that could be applicable, the rule of thumb is you will always default to the one that gives you the higher classification. That is because the authorities would rather manufacturers err on the side of caution. So having classified your device, the next step is going to be for your notified body to conduct a conformity assessment. The definition of conformity assessment is in Article 2, paragraph 40. And it says, conformity assessment means the process demonstrating whether the requirements of this regulation relating to a device have been fulfilled. Conformity assessment under the European system always involves 2 strands of evidence: quality system-based plus a product-based assessment. You need these 2 strands of evidence for your device to be certified. And you must demonstrate compliance with each set of requirements, i.e. QMS-based requirements and product assessment-based requirements. And the requirements and conformity assessments are in Articles 52, 54. This is where you can find out what it's all about. And then Annexes 9, 10, and 11 tells you how to go about demonstrating compliance. I think I'll stop here. I'll pause for a minute here and describe a few things. In the MDR, there are 3 main sections, 3 main requirements. One is the legal context, which is prefaced with whereas. There are 101 whereases. There are 123 articles. The articles are the what's. And there are at least 16 annexes, which are the hows, how you go about implementing and demonstrating compliance with the regulation. So conformity assessment is also dependent on device classification and some additional features. In other words, is it implantable? Does it use animal tissue or utilize animal tissue? Does it contain non-viable human tissues? Does it incorporate a medicinal substance or other substances? Does it include nanomaterials, etc.? And then, of course, there are always special cases. Article 22 deals with procedure packs. Annex 13 deals with custom devices. And Article 17 deals with those devices that could be part of a medicinal product. So conformity assessments may involve more than one route for a given classification. It is you, the manufacturer, that will choose the conformity assessment route. The notified body will verify the appropriateness and assess against the chosen annexes. That's the way it works. So, as I indicated 2 slides before, there are 2 strands of evidence for conformity assessment. One is the quality assessment annexes, of which there are two. Annex 9, excluding Chapter 2, which is essentially based on ISO 13485, covers design, manufacture, and final inspection. It ensures that there is a valid design process and that the device is manufactured in compliance with the technical documentation. Remember, the technical documentation is the repository of all the information you are putting forward to the notified body to demonstrate compliance. On the other hand, you may go for Annex 11 Part A, which is production quality assurance. In this case, a bit like it's allowed under 13485, it excludes design. So really, it covers manufacture and final inspection. It ensures that the device is manufactured, tested, and or inspected in compliance with the technical documentation. So this gives you the left-hand side of this equation. But like any equation, it's got to be balanced off with the product side of the house. Here, we're talking about product assessment annexes, of which there are three, starting with Annex 2, Chapter 2, whereby you need to put together a technical documentation, which has to be submitted for examination. The notified bodies conduct the examination. It's a one-off examination, but as we indicated before, it has to be combined with a module to demonstrate consistency of manufacture. So in this case, you may be going for Annex 9, Chapter 1, combine that with Annex 9, Chapter 2, for instance. Next, under product assessment annexes is Annex 10, type examination, whereby you provide to the notified body a device, your device, plus the technical documentation that you wish to submit. In this case, the notified body then tests the device to check it meets certain type typically described in harmonized standards, conducts an examination of the documentation. Again, it's a one-off examination and has to be combined with another module to demonstrate consistency of manufacture. I need to point something out here. Unlike Annex 9, Chapter 2, where you're only providing a technical documentation, with Annex 10, keep in mind, you also have to provide your device with the notified body must test. Then Annex 11, Part B, production verification. This is where the notified body examines every individual device and would conduct tests typically defined in harmonized standards. Devices verified against the technical documentation and type examination certificate if applicable. In other words, you could combine Annex 9 and aspects of Annex 11 Part B2. However, with this particular type of certificate, you find that the duration of the certificate is batch limited. So you'll be certified for the batch that has been manufactured. And that certificate will be valid until the next batch is manufactured. So these are your options. And there's no right or wrong. It's down to the business model of the manufacturer, which options or combination of options they wish to go for. For instance, you may argue, why would anybody want to consider Annex 10? Well, not many people do, which is why certificates under Annex 10 are typically very small in numbers. But then it's an option. There's a place for that approach if that fits with the manufacturer's business model. But most folks would go with Annex 9, Chapter 2. Next will be the general safety and performance requirements. To my mind, this is the guts of the regulation. It's in Annex 1. That tells you everything you need to know. It's pretty comprehensive. It shows how a manufacturer can demonstrate compliance with the MDR. There are over 180 requirements. It's about 14 pages long, covering three key areas: general requirements, design and manufacturing, information supplied with the device. We'll go through this very quickly. The very first 8 are applicable to every device placed on the market in Europe. So if any manufacturer says one of these requirements is not applicable, that will not be acceptable to a notified body. And very quickly, they're as follows, and I'm paraphrasing here. GSPR 1 talks to safety and performance as intended by the manufacturer, considering the acknowledged state of the art. GSPR 2 deals with risk reduction as far as possible. GSPR 3 is risk management. Essentially, it's a regurgitation of everything you need to do under EN ISO 14971-2019. GSPR 4 talks to risk control. 5 talks to risk of use error, including ergonomics. GSPR 6, lifetime of the device defined. GSPR 7, packaging, transportation, and storage. And GSPR 8, undesirable side effects to be minimized, whereby the benefits must outweigh the risks. GSPR 9 really doesn't apply to mainstream medical devices because it talks to devices without a medical purpose. Then the other GSPRs are 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Now, I must point something out. This is a very high-level presentation of these GSPRs. For instance, GSPR 10 that deals with chemical, physical, and biological properties has, believe it or not, 6 subsections. Some of them are very deep as well. For instance, subsection 10.4 goes from 10.4.1 to 10.4.5. GSPR 11 that talks to infection and microbial contamination covers sterilization, validation, and sterility maintenance. Believe it or not, has 8 subsections. For instance, subparagraph 11.1 goes from A to D. So this is why you must pay attention to every line item and, if applicable, provide evidence to demonstrate compliance. GSPR 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23 complete the list. 23 is information supplied by the manufacturer, and it has 4 paragraphs. 1 is the general requirements. That's 23.1. 23.2 deals with the labels. 23.3 deals with information for products for which sterility has to be maintained, and 23.4 talks to the IFU. 23.4 in itself has subsections A to Z, and then goes on to AA and AB. So I'm just trying to illustrate how extensive these GSPRs are. It's a lot of information that the manufacturer has to provide to the notified body relating to their device. In turn, the notified body must spend time to review each line item and make a decision whether or not it's compliant with the regulations. These are part of the reasons why conducting conformity assessment under the MDR is significantly longer than doing same under the MDD. Next bit is the technical documentation. This is the repository of all those bits of information you have been creating. The requirements are in Annexes 2 and 3 of the MDR. And it clearly says that the manufacturer has to draw up a technical documentation which has to be clear, organized, readily searchable, and unambiguous, and shall include the particular elements listed in each one of those annexes. That's the requirement. In reality, oftentimes, manufacturers receive documentation that's similar to the picture on the right-hand side of this slide. So, Annex 2, technical documentation requirements. This will be what I call traditional technical documentation. This is information pre-market, and there are 6 main sections: device description and specification, which includes variants and accessories; information to be supplied by the manufacturer, which is essentially GSPR 23, which would cover the labels and IFU; design and manufacturing information. This is where you must disclose every bit of information relating to manufacturing of your device, the design and manufacturing of your device, including the adjuvants, your processing aids, everything. Next is the general safety and performance requirements, which I had already talked to, i.e. Annex 1. And then, of course, your risk management, including your benefit risk analysis. We know these devices will always have some risk associated with them. But do the benefits really outweigh the risks? You have to make that determination. And of course, product verification and validation. You've got to validate your processes. You've got to make sure that your processes are stable and that you can consistently produce compliant products. And then in the post-market phase, the requirements are much more explicit under the MDR than they ever were under the MDD. And the 2 main sections are post-market surveillance plan drawn up in accordance with Article 54, and the periodic safety update reports reported in Article 6, and the post-market surveillance report referred to in Article 85. I'll talk to the PMS requirements later on in this presentation. At this point, I want to segue a little bit to another item that manufacturers need to take on board. Under the MDR, the requirement for competence is significantly higher and much more explicit. Manufacturers should also be aware of this. And the guidance document that will help you make this determination as it relates to your device is MDCG 2019-14. And typically, these codes fall into 3 buckets: the vertical, which relates to the product; then horizontal, which could be applicable to that type of product; and the technology, which is very specific as to the technology required to make the device. In this example, I've opted for a drug-eluting stent. So for the stent itself, it's a non-active implant, long-term, surgically invasive device, which means MDN code 1101 will be the best fit. It's a non-active cardiovascular device, and you can see the devices that are covered. In other words, specific considerations. But a stent is always used in conjunction with other products or accessories, such as catheters, balloon, or indeed guide wire. So you could see that in this example, MDN 1203 will also be applicable. As it relates to the horizontal codes, because it's a drug-eluting stent, you've got to go for MDS 101. devices incorporating medicinal substances. So any device that incorporates a medicinal substance must have that code as well. Then, because it's going to be sold sterile, MDS 1005 would also be applicable. In terms of the technology, clearly, for the metallic component, you're going to use metal processing methods. And for the plastic components, you're going to use plastic processing methods such as injection molding, extrusion, blending, bonding of polymers, etc. So that kind of gives you an idea of how these product codes work. And this will be required when you make your application to your notified body. Risk management. The truth of the matter is this. The MDR has risk analysis, risk management mentioned at least 250 times, which essentially means this regulation is a risk management regulation. And the harmonized standard for conducting risk management is EN ISO 14971-2019. And it typically covers a risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk control, and then you do your determination of residual risk and an overall evaluation of residual risks, because some of these things can then be listed either as warnings or contraindications in your IFU. You're then expected to conduct a risk management review before going into the post-production activities, same as post-market surveillance. Again, we'll talk to that a little bit more. But these devices are man-made, which means they will never be risk-free. Hence, keep in mind that safety, as defined in clause 3.26 of this standard, is freedom from unacceptable risk. Implied in this definition is that there will always be some risk. The job of the manufacturer is to reduce this risk as low as possible. So it's an iterative process. You cannot just sit back on your laurels, because based on today's knowledge, we may determine that the threshold of risk is acceptable. But as more information becomes available, you may go back to revise what is now an acceptable risk. Because if you can further reduce the risk based on new information, the authorities expect the manufacturer to do just that. The next big ticket item will be clinical evaluation. And I'll take this in steps. Going from the bottom of this slide up, I'm looking at clinical data. So you can generate you have to generate some clinical data. You could do that in one or a combination of several ways. You could do it through scientific literature for equivalent device, if that's what you wish to claim, bench testing, clinical investigation, or relevant clinical PMS information that you may have generated. You then have to weigh up if the clinical data is robust enough to support the claims you wish to make on your device. The other strand of evidence you need will be clinical evaluation, which is a systematic and planned process to continually analyze and assess your clinical data. Use this clinical evaluation to verify safety and performance and benefits of your device. The higher the risk of your device, the more clinical data will be required. If you wish to claim equivalence, i.e. clinical equivalence, as opposed to FDA substantial equivalence, in Europe, it requires an agreement with the manufacturer to access their technical data. And clinical equivalence in Europe also means you have to demonstrate compliance with 3 buckets: technical, biological, and clinical. They've raised the bar, making it very difficult to claim clinical equivalence in Europe. But it's still possible. Then these 2 strands of evidence, or these 2 strands of data, then go into what we call clinical evidence. Data and clinical evaluation pertaining to a device. You need a sufficient amount and quality so that a qualified assessment can be made to determine if your device is safe and achieves the intended clinical benefits when used as intended by the manufacturer. Again, we're going back to the intended purpose as defined by the manufacturer. Now, in this context, if you notice, they've not stipulated any amount. They say sufficient. What does that mean? It's up to the manufacturer. You have to make your case. And we heard that phrase earlier before, state of the art. State of the art does not necessarily imply the most technologically advanced solution. But what they're talking about is that it embodies what is currently generally accepted as good practice in technology and medicine. So whatever you wish to claim as a manufacturer has to be claimed in this context. So, post-market surveillance. Remember, these are the activities that are required after you pop that champagne and launch your device. The definition is Article 2, paragraph 60, and says it means all activities carried out by the manufacturers in cooperation with other economic operators to institute and keep up to date a systematic procedure to proactively collect and review experience gained from devices they place on the market. All activities. Indeed, post-market surveillance has 2 aspects to it: reactive and proactive. Reactive, as the name suggests, is manufacturer reacts following some incident. So it could be a product complaint. It could be a vigilance that has been reported to the competent authorities. But with proactive PMS, the authorities expect manufacturers to go out into the market and gain some information about their device in the real world. Because before going to market, we make certain assumptions about our device. We probably leverage from past experience, tweak the design, and come up with an amended or a new design. That's okay. But when you are now in the marketplace, do you get the expected results? The reasons are as follows. Medical practice does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The competency of the clinicians does vary. Don't tell me the chief surgeon from Mayo Clinic his skill set can be compared with the chief surgeon from, I don't know, Timbuktu. Who knows? What about the chief surgeon from some remote part of maybe China, Australia, India? Even in one country, practice does vary from place to place. So this is why if you are going to be selling your device to the whole world, then we need to understand how your device truly performs in or on humans. So PMS requires its own documentation. You need a plan. a post-market clinical follow-up plan. This is part of proactive PMS. If you have a plan, you're going to have corresponding reports. So you need a PMS report, including a periodic safety update report and a PMCF evaluation report. So the PMS plan covers the following: process to characterize your device performance as it compares to similar devices, thresholds for risks, how to investigate complaints and feedback. Remember, complaints and vigilance will be in the reactive PMS branch. Methods for trend reporting, procedures for preventive and corrective actions, and your PMCF plan, post-market clinical follow-up plan, or a justification if you feel you don't need it. I tell you now, this will be a very high bar for a notified body to accept that you don't, that justification. It's got to be a very, very low risk device for which there are no known or emerging risks. Then the PMCF plan does aim to confirm safety and performance. I think I've alluded to this before. It does help to identify and monitor side effects and contraindications. It does help to monitor and identify risks, and does help in that benefit risk analysis. Also, it does help to identify misuse or off-label use. Off-label use is very, very difficult to regulate. But in the circumstances that happens with your device, PMCF could be one way of gathering meaningful information about your device. So the plan includes methods to collect and evaluate the data, user feedback, literature, registries, access to registries, and of course, PMCF studies. You could also use standards. And in Europe, we now have what they call common specifications. Common specifications are a top-up to the standards, where the authorities believe for a given therapeutic area, if they don't believe the standards go far enough, then Europe will write a common specification, which could be used in conjunction with applicable standards. As you would expect, having talked about the plans, there are corresponding reports. Your PMS report, which include results of your PMS plan, a description of the preventive and corrective actions taken, your PSUR report, results of your PMS plan, description of preventive and corrective action, benefit risk determination, finding sales volumes, so that they could put these results you are getting into context. Are we talking about 10 incidents out of 100 devices? Are we talking about 10 incidents out of 1 million devices sold worldwide? Size and characters of the user population. We know there are differences in demographics. Are we talking about Caucasian, Asian, African, or what? Are we talking about males or females? So these are all the types of information they expect you to report in your PSUR. And of course, the frequency of usage. So you also need to create another document called SSCP. So a comparison is as follows. With the PSUR, the scope covers all devices. And really, this is information for the national competent authorities. It provides them with an overview of the device's continued post-market significance, performance, and safety. Remember, these competent authorities are there for the sole purpose of keeping an eye on public health. So they are the ones who will be monitoring these PSUR reports and making those determinations. The data should be collected from the day you have your MDR certificate. It should have also been from the date of application, but that is well gone now, 26th of May, 2021. And the requirement is for this report to be updated for Class 3 and 2B devices annually, and for 2A when necessary, but at least every 2 years. This is interesting. So they're leaving it up to the manufacturer whether you choose to do this report every year for 2A device or at least every 2 years. You can find further details in the guidance document MDCG 2022-21. The SSCP Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance it's meant for implantable and Class 3 devices other than custom or investigational devices. And this is to provide both healthcare workers and lay people, patients, information about your device. Okay? It is not for general device on the diagnosis or treatment of particular medical conditions. And it is not meant to replace your IFU. But this is a document whereby Joe Public, somebody with at least some basic education, if they are going to have surgery, can educate themselves, read about your device before going for the surgery. It's a way of raising awareness about these devices we place on the market. Again, you've got to update the content of this report as they change, because remember, you are continuously gathering information. People, patients, potential patients will be reading these documents. Therefore, whatever they read has to reflect current thinking, current piece of information. This slide provides a list of useful guidance documents for your consideration, including where you could go access all these documents we've been talking about. So, I created this slide to illustrate something, i.e., a typical EU certification journey. The journey typically starts with somebody having an idea, maybe over dinner, maybe you're having a shower and that eureka moment happens. You sketch your idea on a piece of paper, you take it to the office, you discuss it, people sign up to it, think, oh, this is a great idea. Management reviews it and hopefully signs off on it. That becomes the official starting of your project. Of course, the idea is still crude. So what happens is you go through design iterations until you achieve design freeze. So I'm looking at that orange arrow going from left to right. So the first major milestone is design freeze. And in my opinion and experience, from when you reach design freeze, it is highly recommended you engage a notified body. The earlier you do, the better. That way, your notified body can be your true partner on your journey to certification. Because after design freeze, you start developing your processes. That's probably when you want to train your people to have a better understanding of the regulations, to have a better understanding of, risk management. What does it really mean? You conduct verification and validation of your processes. You compile your QMS documentation, because at that point, you are gearing up to get your notified body to come and conduct a QMS audit, hopefully against ISO 13485, which is the certification you need to register your devices in most geographies of the world. Meanwhile, you're also conducting bench testing, animal testing, clinical trials. These activities take time. All the while, you're compiling your technical documentation. You're also having all of those reports I touched on, i.e. your risk management report, your clinical evaluation report, PSUR report, PMCF report, SSCP report, etc. All those reports go in your technical documentation, which you then submit to your notified body for review. Notified body then does this review, conducts this review. I already described the GSPRs. There are 23 of them, and you saw how lengthy they are. You begin to understand why it takes notified bodies upwards of 12 months to complete their technical documentation review. Hopefully, that review is successfully completed. They issue their certificate. The manufacturer signs up on the declaration of conformity, affixes the CE mark, and then launches the device, and hopefully begins to implement their PMS processes. That kind of gives you a very good summary of what a typical EU certification journey looks like. So in conclusion, I humbly submit that following the outlined EU regulatory process should make you avoid a coronary. Thank you for listening.
Eben, thank you very much for the presentation. Only just scratching the surface on MDR for cardiovascular devices, and I'm sure that startup companies would have more questions, and we invite you to reach out to us for a private conversation about your journey on your product development and ultimately what the business plans are for the device. So we've had an intimate discussion today. This wasn't intended to be a very large webinar full of hundreds of people. We wanted to invite startups, and that's what we got. There are not any questions in the chat box. I was thinking of asking Eben about the timelines, but you went through that on your last slide, so you kind of beat me to it. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the recent ending of the extension for MDD going into MDR. Now, if you're a startup, you likely don't have an MDD certification to begin with, but it's still part of the larger ecosystem of medical device certifications where other large cardiovascular companies like Abbott, Edwards, Boston Scientific are in the middle of MDD's recertifications to MDR. Perhaps we could take a minute and talk about that and how some of these startups might fit in with that larger amount of companies that have come to the system seeking MDR certification.
That's a question in the chat.
Yeah, well, why don't we just go to that? What are some of the current challenges in the MDR process? Which is.
Can I take that, Greg?
Go right ahead.
So, if you think about it, the processes I've just described are not markedly dissimilar to the processes under the MDD. You may recall a few years ago when under the MDD, when the guidance document MedDev 2.7.1 Rev 4 was published, everybody was going crazy. So what the authorities did was to step up clinical evaluation requirements. in the build-up to the MDR. What has subsequently happened is the area that most manufacturers are finding challenging is in the PMS activities. Post-market surveillance requirements were always there under the MDD. In fact, if you go into Annex II, Section 3.117 dent of the MDD, it talks to experience gained in the post-production phase. But manufacturers and notified bodies alike didn't do a good job of it. So what they've done is create Annex III under the MDR, and they are now very explicit in terms of what manufacturers must do under the PMS. Now, today, I talked about PMS. I talked about the plans, the report. I talked about PSUR. I talked about the plans, the reports. I talked about SSCP. In addition to risk management report, in addition to clinical evaluation report, these are all interlinked. So the biggest challenge is figuring out how all these pieces fit together and working in a smart way whereby once you establish that template, whenever you get new information, it will automatically, if you may, update these various reports. I see that as the biggest challenge under the MDR.
Very good, thank you. I suppose I would urge everyone that has attended here, please reach out to SGS if you have certification questions. SGS is open for business for startup companies in the cardiovascular space. We're happy to talk to any prospect at any time about what your business plans are, your needs for certification, and how we can attempt to help you get there. We're big fans of startups. They're a very, very important part of R&D in the cardiovascular space. So please, our email addresses are on here. Please send me a note or send us a friend request on LinkedIn. Happy to talk at any time. I want to thank you for coming today. There are no more questions in the chat box. We'll give you back your time. Thank you for coming and very much appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you.